Hello students, welcome to the logic class. Today we will resume our discussion from Dillema. Now we will discuss refutation and rebuttal of dilemma. Refutation means rejection. How do you reject a dilemma? That is called refutation. Dilemmatic arguments are in most cases formally valid. Formally valid means all the rules are applied correctly. When rules are applied correctly, then the dilemma is formally valid. When the rules are not applied correctly, then the dilemma is invalid. But in most of the cases, we find that dilemmatic arguments are formally valid. Sometimes these dilemmatic arguments are materially false. You know, the dilemma, the word dilemma means die plus lemma, that means double assumptions. So, dilemma is based on double assumptions. What do you mean by assumptions? Assumptions means hypothetical propositions. So, a dilemma is based on two hypothetical propositions, which is your major premise. But sometimes these two assumptions are wrong assumptions. These assumptions or these hypothetical propositions are wrong propositions. And if the opponent is a very clever opponent and he is very witty opponent, he will immediately point out that the assumptions on which the dilemma is based are wrong assumptions. So, this is how he can reject the dilemma. This is how he can refute a dilemma, and this is known as refutation of the dilemma, and the opponent can make the dilemma ineffective by pointing out that the assumptions or the hypothetical propositions are wrong propositions or wrong assumptions. Then what is rebuttal? Rebuttal is not refutation. In rebuttal, what do? We manipulate the premises. We manipulate the premises in such a way that we get one counter dilemma, we get one counter dilemma or opposite dilemma, and the conclusion of the opposite dilemma is favorable to the person, advantageous to the person. Okay? So, this is your refutation. रेफ्यूटेशन माने हैला रिजेक्शन. आमे केमिति गोटे डिलेमा को रिजेक्ट करिवो. केमिति रिजेक्ट करिवो? डिलेमाटिक आर्ग्युमेंट्स गुडा प्राय फॉर्मली वैलिड थांती, कारण सब रूल गुडा को ठीक भाव में सेठी एप्लीकेबल हेई थाए इन मोस्ट ऑफ द केसेस. किंतु बेले बेले कौन हुए, डिलेमा माने डाई प्लस लेमा, डबल आसम्पशंस. डिलेमा दुईटा आसम्पशन उपरे बेस करी थाए. आसम्पशन माने तुमर हैला दुईटा हाइपोथेटिकल प्रपोजिशंस, जोटा तुमर मेजर प्रेमिस, कंपाउंड हाइपोथेटिकल प्रपोजिशन. से दुईटा हाइपोथेटिकल प्रपोजिशंस बेले बेले रॉन्ग थांती. आ जदि तुमर अपोनेंट, तुमर विपक्ष जो लोक थिबो, से जदि बहुत क्लेभर हेइथिबो, चालाक हेइथिबो, ताहले से सांगे सांगे कहिबो जे जो असम्पशन उपरे बेस करिछि डिलेमा, जो हाइपोथेटिकल प्रपोजिशंस उपरे बेस करिछि, से हाइपोथेटिकल प्रपोजिशंस गुडा होचंदी रॉन्ग प्रपोजिशंस. जदि ताकू रॉन्ग कहीदेला ताहले एठी कौन हैला, डिलेमाटा रेफ्यूट हेगला, रिजेक्ट हेगला. ओके तेणु एटा होची तुमरा रेफ्यूटेशन ऑफ डिलेमा नाउ you know in a dilemma the major premise is a compound hypothetical proposition. So compound hypothetical proposition means there are two hypothetical propositions, if then and if then. So there are two antecedents and two consequence. बेले बेले कौन हुए देखिबो one consequent does not follow from its antecedent or both the consequents do not follow from their antecedents. माने गोटे consequent तार antecedent रू follow करिवनी किंबा दीटा जाक consequence मध्य तार antecedents रू follow करिवो नाही. So here one can refute the dilemma by showing that either one consequent or both the consequents do not follow from their antecedents, and this is called taking the dilemma by the horn. This is called taking the dilemma by the horn. Then what is taking the dilemma by the horn? टेकिंग द डिलेमा बाय द हॉर्न माने गोटे कन्सिक्वेंट और दुईटा कन्सिक्वेंट तार एंटीसीडेंट रू फॉलो करिबो नाही. सो दिस रेफ्यूटेशन इज कॉल्ड टेकिंग द डिलेमा बाय द हॉर्न. व्हेन वन कन्सिक्वेंट डज नॉट फॉलो फ्रॉम इट्स एंटीसीडेंट इट इज कॉल्ड टेकिंग द डिलेमा बाय one of its hons. गोटे consequent जदि follow कला नहीं तार antecedent रू ताकू कहा जीवो taking the dilemma by one of its hons. When both the consequents do not follow from their antecedents, it is called taking the dilemma by both the hons. Now we will discuss taking the dilemma by one of its hons. ता माने गोटे consequent तार antecedent to follow करिबो नाही. Now let us see the example. Example is, yes, simple constructive dilemma can be refuted. तुम्हारा question आसीबो dash dilemma can be refuted. You have to write simple constructive dilemma can be refuted. Now the example is, if the patient is destined to live, then calling a doctor is unnecessary. If the patient is destined to die, then calling a doctor is unnecessary. Minor premise, here we affirm both the antecedents disjunctively. Either the patient is destined to live or destined to die. And in the conclusion we affirm the consequent. Here you see we have a common consequent. Dita jaka consequent common achi, saman achi. So this is the conclusion is calling a doctor is unnecessary. So this is your argument. Now the opponent will say that here the consequent does not follow from its antecedent. First देखो consequent माने दीटा जाक समान consequent अच्छी, common consequent अच्छी. If the patient is destined to live, calling a doctor is unnecessary. जदि patient बंचीबार अच्छी ताहले आमे डाक्तर को डाकिबा दरकार नाही. But even if the patient is destined to live, still we have to call a doctor. The opponent says, जदि भी तार बंचीबार अच्छी आमको डाक्तर डाकिबा को पड़िबो. Why? Because he is suffering a lot and he is getting a lot of pain, and that is quite intolerable pain. So why should the patient suffer like this? We should call a doctor. If the doctor comes, he will prescribe some medicines, he will give some injection, then at least he will get some relief, the patient will get some relief. Doctor asile tar pain कम हबो. तेणु calling a doctor is unnecessary does not follow from this antecedent. Okay. Then the second hypothetical proposition you see, if the patient is destined to die then calling a doctor is unnecessary. जदि से पेसेंट डेथ हबार अच्छी ताहले डाक्तर डाकिबा दरकार नहीं, से तो मरीज आम कहीं डाक्तर डाकिबा. दिस इज द आर्ग्यूमेंट. Now the opponent, suppose the patient is a cancer patient and he is at his last stage and he is having a lot of pain, lot of suffering, and he is going through trauma and all these things occurring to the patient. Then the opponent will say that even if the patient is destined to die, why shouldn't we call a doctor? His pain will be lessened if the doctor comes and the patient takes some medicine, if the patient takes some injection, then his pain will reduce. So, this conclusion, calling a doctor is unnecessary, does not follow from the antecedent. So, this is your refutation 1. Calling a doctor is unnecessary, this is consequent, and this consequent does not follow from its antecedents. Okay? So, this is called taking the dilemma by one of its horns. That means, one consequent does not follow from its antecedent. Now, the second one, taking the dilemma by both the horns. So, here what happens? Here both the consequents do not follow from their antecedents. Both the consequents do not follow from their antecedents. So, dilemmatic argument is there and the opponent will refute the dilemma. Opponent will reject the dilemma. He will say, no, both the consequents do not follow from their antecedents. So, this dilemma is not a correct dilemma, this is a wrong dilemma. Se kahiba eta hoche wrong dilemma. Now, let us see the example. The dilemma is like this. If you were intelligent, then you would see the worthlessness of your argument. तुमे जदि इंटेलिजेंट हेई थांत ताहले तुम आर्ग्युमेंट जे वर्थलेस मूल्यहीन सेटा जानी पारि थांत. If you were honest, then you would admit those to be wrong. आउ तुमे जदि ऑनेस्ट हेई थांत ताहले तुमे एटा को रॉन्ग बोली भूल बोली एक्सेप्ट करी थांत. सो दिस इज योर compound hypothetical proposition. Then minor premise. In the minor premise, we deny both the consequence. Either you do not see the worthlessness of your argument or you do not admit those to be wrong. आइदर तुमे तुमर आर्ग्युमेंट को वर्थलेस बोली जानी पारुन किंबा सेटा को रॉन्ग बोली मध्य कहू नाह. देन कंक्लूजन. हियर वी डिनाय द antecedent. आइदर you are not intelligent or you are not honest. So, here in this argument, this dilemma is a complex disjunctive dilemma. Here, by denying the consequence of the major premise in the minor premise, we deny the antecedents in the conclusion. So, this is the dilemma. Now, let us see what will the opponent say. Opponent वर्तमान कौन कहिबो? Opponent will say that yes, this is the dilemma, but your dilemma is a wrong dilemma, because here both the consequence do not follow from their antecedents. Both the consequence do not follow from their antecedents. How? से वर्तमान कौन कहिबो? से कहिबो First hela, if you were intelligent, you would see the worthlessness of your argument. If you were intelligent is your antecedent, you would see the worthlessness of your argument is your consequent. Then if you were honest is antecedent, then you would admit those to be wrong is your consequent. Well, now let us see the first hypothetical proposition. If you were intelligent, you would see the worthlessness of your argument. Now, the opponent will say, yes, I know I am intelligent. Yes, I know I am intelligent. Mu janichi je mu intelligent. And being intelligent, I know that my argument is not worthless. My argument is not worthless. My argument is a proper argument. My argument is a sound argument. So, here this conclusion, this consequent does not follow from its antecedent. ओके से कहला मु इंटेलिजेंट अच्छी मु जानी जे मु इंटेलिजेंट थिबारु मु कहूचे जे मु जो आर्ग्युमेंट देइचे सेटा मूल्यहीन नुहे दैट इज ए प्रॉपर आर्ग्युमेंट दैट इज ए साउंड आर्ग्युमेंट. देन द सेकेंड हाइपोथेटिकल प्रोपोजिशन, इफ यू आर ऑनेस्ट देन यू वुड एडमिट दोज टू बी रॉन्ग. एठी अपोनेंट कौन कहबो? अपोनेंट कहबो यस आई एम ऑनेस्ट and being honest I will not say that this is wrong, this is correct, this is not wrong, this is right. So, here you see how does he refute the dilemma. Here he says that both the consequence do not follow from their antecedents. Okay? So, refutation 1 we saw, refutation means here the first refutation is taking the dilemma by the horn. Then it is of two types, taking the dilemma by one of its horns, second one is taking the dilemma by both the horns. जेते बेले गोटे consequent follow करिबनी ता antecedent रू सेटा को कुहा जिवो taking the dilemma by one of its horns. जेते बेले दुईटा जाका consequent follow करिबो नाही तारो antecedent रू ताको कुहा जिवो taking the dilemma by both the horns. I think you understand this. Then refutation 2. Refutation 2 is known as escaping between the horns. Escaping between the horns. You know, in a dilemma, there are only two alternatives or two options. And these two alternatives, these two options are exhaustive in character. There is no third alternative. Third alternative kichhi nahi, and both the alternatives are quite undesirable alternatives, very bad alternatives, and the opponent does not want to accept any of the alternatives. Se kahaku accept karibaku chahu nahi, because whatever he accepts he will be in trouble, but he is bound to accept one of the alternatives. Okay? So, this is your dilemma. So, that means in the dilemma there are only two alternatives, duita alternatives ache. But sometimes the opponent may point out that there are not only two alternatives, there is a third alternative, and third alternative is quite advantageous to him, and the third alternative is quite comfortable to him, and he can gladly accept the third alternative. तेणु सी कौन करिवो, से कहिवो केवल दुईटा अल्टरनेटिव नुहे थर्ड अल्टरनेटिव मध्य अछि, आ सेटा को से बहुत खुशी रे एक्सेप्ट करिवो. Okay. So, here one example is given. This is a classic example. One Athenian mother asks her son not to go outside, because her son is always in the habit of going outside, and his mother dissuades him from going outside. That is why the mother gives a dilemmatic argument. So let us see what is this argument. This is an interesting argument. If the day is hot, then you should not go out to avoid exhaustion, and if the day is cold, you should not go out to avoid exposure. जदि गरम होथिबो तू बाहर को जिबुनी because you will be exhausted, you will be tired, so you should not go out. आउ जदि ठंडा होथिबो then also you should not go out because you may catch cold or fever. So this is the compound hypothetical proposition. Now the minor premise, in the minor premise we disjunctively affirm the antecedents. Either the day is hot or the day is cold. तेणु दिन में गरम हबो नहले ठंडा हबो. So this is your minor premise. So conclusion is you should not go out either to avoid exhaustion or to avoid exposure. तेणु तू बाहर को जीवु नाही. यदि बाहर को जीवो आइदर एग्जॉस्टेड हबो, टायर्ड हबो, नहले तते ठंडा जर हबो. So mother is giving this argument. Now the son is very clever, the son is very intelligent. Now he says, yes mom, I will not go at that time, but some part of the day we find there is a very pleasant weather and there is a breezy weather. बेले बेले बहुत सुंदर वेदर थाए, पवन बहुत थिबो. So at that time I can go out. So here you see how he gets a third alternative, and third alternative is advantageous to him, and he will say that I can gladly accept the third alternative. So this is called escaping between the horns. So two horns are there. Two horns means two alternative propositions, and he will escape in between the two horns. दुईटा हॉर्न भितरे से एस्केप करिकरी पड़ेबो. So this is known as escaping between the horns. This is your refutation 2. Now we will discuss rebuttal. What is this rebuttal? Rebuttal is not refutation. Here we do not reject the original dilemma. Refutation रे जमिति आमे reject करू देउथिले original dilemma को, किंतु rebuttal रे we will not reject the original dilemma. We will not say anything about the original dilemma. Here what do? We manipulate the premises. In such a way we manipulate that we get a counter dilemma. Got a opposite dilemma ame paibo. And the conclusion of the counter dilemma is very favorable to us, is very advantageous to us. Okay? But there is a technique to do this rebuttal. So what do we do here? You know, in a dilemma, the major premise is a compound hypothetical proposition. So there are two hypothetical propositions, if then and if then. So accordingly there are two antecedents and two consequences. Here what will we do? We will not change the antecedents. Antecedents जेमिति अच्छी सेमिति रहिबो. Antecedent को हमें change करिबा नहीं. Then we will introduce a negative sign into the consequence. Consequence रे गोटे negative sign or not हमें बसेई दबा, भर्ती करी दबा. Or else we can take the contraries of the consequence. Consequence रा contraries भी हमें नहीं पारिबा. Okay. So we introduce a negative sign into the consequence or we take the contraries of the consequence. Then the next step, we transpose both the consequence. We interchange the place of the consequence. That means the first consequent will come to the second one and the second consequent will go to the first one. Then we will get the conclusion which will be a favorable conclusion. You see, so what are the points? First, the antecedents of the hypothetical proposition remain unchanged in the counter dilemma. जो counter dilemma में आनिबा opposite dilemma आनिबा सेथिरे antecedent दीटा को change करिबा नाही जेमिति अछि सेमति रहिबो. Then next step, a negative sign is introduced into the consequence or contraries of the consequence are taken. गोटे negative sign not बसई दबा नहले तार contraries नहीं जिवो. Third, consequence interchange their position. दीटा consequence रा place change करी दबा. First टा second को आसीबो, second टा first को जिवो. Then fourth, the conclusion of the counter dilemma is opposite to the conclusion of the original dilemma. जो conclusion हमें पाइबो counter dilemma रे से जो conclusion पाइबो that conclusion is the opposite of the conclusion of the original dilemma. And here only complex constructive dilemma can be rebutted. Your question comes, does dilemma can be rebutted? So you will write only complex constructive dilemma can be rebutted. Now let us see one example, symbolic example. The original dilemma is like this. If A is B, then C is D, and if E is F, then G is H. Minor premise, either A is B or E is F. Conclusion, either C is D or G is H. Here you see in the major premise, A is B antecedent, C is D consequent, E is F antecedent, then G is H is your consequent. Then in the minor premise, we have affirmed disjunctively the antecedents, A is B or E is F. Then in the conclusion, we have affirmed the consequence disjunctively, either C is D or G is H. एठी वर्तमान आमे कौन करिबा हमर दुईटा consequent कौन रहिला C is D and G is H, दुईटा consequence. Now we will put a sign not in the consequence. C is D, we will say C is not D. Then G is H, we will say G is not H. So here we introduce a negative sign into the consequence. Okay? Then what will we do? जो C is D अच्छी तुमरा फर्स्ट हाइपोथेटिकल प्रोपोजिशन रे सेटा को हमें सेकेंड को नहीं आसीबा सेकेंड हाइपोथेटिकल प्रोपोजिशन रा कन्सिक्वेंट करिबा देन सेकेंड रा जोटा G is not H अच्छी सेटा को हमें फर्स्ट हाइपोथेटिकल प्रोपोजिशन रा कन्सिक्वेंट करिबा. ओके, नाउ सी रिबटेड डिलेमा. इफ A is B then G is not H. तेणु सेकेंड कन्सिक्वेंट को आमे फर्स्ट कन्सिक्वेंट को नहीं आसिलु. एंड इफ E is F then C is not D. सो हियर फर्स्ट कन्सिक्वेंट को आमे सेकेंड कन्सिक्वेंट को नहीं आसिलु. आइदर A is B or E is F. Therefore either G is not H or C is not D. This is the rebutted dilemma. Now we will see one concrete example of rebutted dilemma. Now what is the dilemma? Let us see the original dilemma. If you act justly, men will hate you, and if you act unjustly, then God will hate you. Minor premise, either you act justly or unjustly. Conclusion, therefore you will be hated either by men or by God. से कहूँ तुम्हें जदि ठीक भाव रे काम करिवो ताहले लोक माने तुमको हेट करिवे, किंतु तुम्हें जदि ठीक भाव रे काम करिवो नाही ताहले तुमको गॉड हेट करिवे. ओके, तुम तेणु माइनर प्रेमिस रे कहूँ आइदर तुम्हें ठीक रे काम करिवो न हेले ठीक रे काम करिवो नाही. Therefore you will be hated either by men or by God. तेणु तुमको गॉड हेट करिवे और मेन मध्य हेट करिवे. So this is the original dilemma. Now let us see how do we get one counter dilemma with the help of this technique. Your consequent is men will hate you. Now I will take the contrary of hate, that is love. Then God will hate you. Hate ro contrary ne be love. Then I will exchange the place of the consequence. Tamane first consequent will come to the second one and second consequent will come to the first one. Now the opponent will bring a counter dilemma. He will say, yes, if I act justly, then God will love me, and if I act unjustly, then men will love me. Either I will act justly or unjustly, therefore I will be loved either by men or by God. So here you see what is the conclusion. Original conclusion कौन थिला? You will be hated either by men or by God. Now in the counter dilemma, what is your conclusion? Your conclusion is a very good conclusion. I will be loved either by men or by God. So here in the counter dilemma, I get a conclusion which is a very good conclusion and which I can accept happily. So this is your counter dilemma and this is the rebuttal. So students, you remember one thing, rebuttal is not refutation. Refutation means we reject the dilemma, we reject the original dilemma. We say that the dilemma is materially false. The compound hypothetical proposition is a false proposition. We say like that, or there are not two alternatives, there is a third alternative. Like this we reject the dilemma. But here in rebuttal, we do not reject the dilemma. We remain silent about the original dilemma. We try to divert the attention of the people from the original dilemma. Then we bring a counter dilemma and the counter dilemma conclusion is very favorable to us, and people, they do not have the time, they do not have the patience to see whether the counter dilemma is a correct dilemma, true dilemma, and the original dilemma is a wrong dilemma. लोकंकर टाइम न थाए देखिबाकू जे काउंटर डिलेमाटा ठीक अच्छी, ओरिजिनल डिलेमाटा भूल अच्छी, एटा देखिबाकू लोकंकर टाइम न थाए. दे आर सिंपली कैरिड अवे बाय द परसुएसिव पावर ऑफ द काउंटर डिलेमा. Okay, so this is your rebuttal of dilemma. So there are three ways in which we can make the dilemma ineffective. The first one is taking the dilemma by the horns, and second one is escaping between the horns, and the third one is your rebuttal. So there are three ways in which we can make the dilemma ineffective. So your mixed syllogism chapter which is in your unit 3 is over. So, here we discussed what is a pure syllogism, what is a mixed syllogism, and we discussed 4 types of mixed syllogisms: hypothetical categorical syllogism, disjunctive categorical syllogism, alternative categorical syllogism, and dilemma. Then hypothetical categorical syllogism, mu tumku kahichi major premise is hypothetical and minor premise is categorical, conclusion is categorical, and it is of 2 forms, constructive and destructive. Constructive rule hela by affirming the antecedent we affirm the consequent, and destructive rule hoche by denying the consequent we deny the antecedent. Then again in the constructive form we have a fallacy. If we violate the rule we have a fallacy, and the fallacy is known as the fallacy of affirming the consequent, fallacy of affirming the consequent. And in the destructive form, by denying the consequent we deny the antecedent. But if we argue in the reverse order, जदि reverse रे आमे उल्टा भाबरे argue करिबा ताहेले हमर fallacy हबो गोटे, fallacy कोन हबो, fallacy of denying the antecedent. एगुडा तुमको सबो मु कहि सारिचे. तापरे disjunctive categorical syllogism, this also I have discussed here. or स्पेशली तुम मैंने मन रखिबो जेतेबेले मु तुमको कहिची और disjunctive proposition is of the form either or. ये जो or टा अच्छी, or is used in the inclusive sense, or is used in the exclusive sense. Inclusive sense माने the one must be right, one of the alternatives must be true, and truth of one includes the possibility of the truth of the other. Both can be true together. आउ ऑटा जेतेबेले एक्सक्लूसिव सेंस रे होची सेतेबेले ट्रूथ ऑफ वन एक्सक्लूड्स द पॉसिबिलिटी ऑफ द ट्रूथ ऑफ द अदर. माने गोटे ट्रू हेले आरटा ट्रू हबो नाही. जेतेबेले इनक्लूसिव सेंस रे और यूज होची सेटा को कुहा जाउची डिसजंक्टिव प्रपोजिशन, जेतेबेले एक्सक्लूसिव डिसजंक्टिव प्रपोजिशन, आउ जेतेबेले एक्सक्लूसिव सेंस रे होची सेटा को कुहा जाउची अल्टरनेटिव प्रपोजिशन. तेणु एटा को भल भाबरे मने रखिबो, because you may confuse between disjunctive proposition and alternative proposition. Okay, so for that in some books it is written in that way, confusing way. So you better you see that bureau book, you will get the correct answer. Now disjunctive categorical syllogism, disjunctive major premise is disjunctive, minor premise is categorical, conclusion is categorical. यारो रूल कौन, तारो रूल होचे denial leads to affirmation. If one of the disjuncts is denied in the minor premise, then the other disjunct is affirmed in the conclusion. Okay, denial leads to affirmation, and this is technically known as modus tollendo ponens. ए technical names गुड़ा को मध्य मने रखिबो, ए गुड़ा exam रे आसे. Then invalid form कौन, जदि रूल टाकु तमे उल्टा भावरे करिबो, violate करिबो, then you will commit a fallacious argument or invalid argument. If affirmation leads to denial, then it becomes fallacious, and here the technical name is modus ponendo tollens. Then in the alternative categorical syllogism, major premise is alternative, minor premise is categorical, and conclusion also is a categorical proposition. Here the form of the alternative proposition is not, both, and. तेणु यार रूल कौन, affirmation leads to denial. If one of the alternatives is affirmed in the minor premise, then the other alternative must be denied in the conclusion. तुमको example देइछि, Hari cannot be born both in January and May. Hari is born in January, so he is not born in May. जदि तुमे एटा को violate करिबो, violate karibo mane if denial leads to affirmation, then you will commit a fallacy and it becomes invalid argument, and this is technically known as modus tollendo ponens. Now in the dilemma, you know, major premise is compound hypothetical proposition, minor premise is disjunctive proposition, and conclusion is either categorical or disjunctive proposition. Rules of dilemma तमर hypothetical categorical proposition रे जहाँ rules एथिरे मध्य सेया rules, same rules, कारण dilemma is not an independent argument. The difference is in hypothetical categorical syllogism only one antecedent, one consequent, but in dilemma you have two antecedents, two consequents, because the major premise is a compound hypothetical proposition. Okay? Now dilemma may be constructive, dilemma may be destructive, and dilemma may be simple, dilemma may be complex. Simple dilemma रे कौन हुए, conclusion categorical हुए, complex dilemma रे कौन हुए, conclusion disjunctive हुए. Simple dilemma either common antecedent or common consequent रहिबो, and complex dilemma रे सबु antecedents and consequents will be different. So we have four forms of dilemma: simple constructive dilemma, complex constructive dilemma, simple destructive dilemma, and complex destructive dilemma. एगुड़ा मु तुमको सब एग्जांपल दे देछि, सिंबॉलिक एग्जांपल लिखिछि, कंक्रीट एग्जांपल मध्य लिखिछि. तापरे तुमर आसिला your formal validity of a dilemma. Formal validity of a dilemma केतेबेले आमे कहूछु जे dilemma टा formally valid when all the rules are applied correctly. जेतेबेले सबु रूल गुड़ाक करेक्टली एप्लिकेबल हबो सेटा सेतेबेले डिलेमा टा फॉर्मली वैलिड हबो. तुमे जानिच डिलेमा रो दुईटा रूल कंस्ट्रक्टिव डिस्ट्रक्टिव तार दुईटा रूल बाय अफर्मिंग द एंटीसीडेंट्स disjunctively in the minor premise we affirm the consequent or consequence in the conclusion. This is rule 1, and rule 2 is by denying the consequence disjunctively in the minor premise we deny the antecedent or antecedents in the conclusion. जदि ए दुईटा जाक रूल ठीक भाव में एप्लिकेबल होइथिबो डिलेमा रे ताकू तुमे कहिबो फॉर्मली वैलिड डिलेमा. आउ जदि डिलेमा रो वैलिडिटी ऊपर डाउट हुए तुमे कोन करिवो से डिलेमा टाकू ब्रेक करिवो, एनालाइज करिवो दुईटा हाइपोथेटिकल कैटेगोरिकल सिलोजिज्म को. कारण डिलेमा रो मेजर प्रेमिस होउची कंपाउंड हाइपोथेटिकल प्रोपोजिशन, तेणु ता धरे दुईटा हाइपोथेटिकल प्रोपोजिशन अछि, तेणु दुईटा को तुमे ब्रेक करिवो दुईटा हाइपोथेटिकल कैटेगोरिकल सिलोजिज्म को. ब्रेक करि सारिकरी तापरे तुमे देखिबो जे रूल्स गुडा ठीक भाव में एप्लिकेबल हेछि ना नाही. जदि हेछि देन फॉर्मली वैलिड, जदि हेइ नाही देन इट इज इनवैलिड. देन it comes your refutation and rebuttal. मु तुमको कहिछि refutation द डिलेमा टा प्राय थाए फॉर्मली वैलिड किंतु बेले बेले से गुडा मटेरियली फॉल्स थाए. केते बेले मटेरियली फॉल्स थिबो डिलेमा दुईटा असम्पशन ऊपर बेस करे, डाइलेमा दुईटा असम्पशन ऊपर बेस करे. दुईटा असम्पशन को दुईटा असम्पशन मीन्स तुमर हाइपोथेटिकल प्रोपोजिशंस. से हाइपोथेटिकल प्रोपोजिशंस गुडा बेले बेले रॉन्ग थाए. जदि रॉन्ग थिबो ताहेले द अपोनेंट इमिडिएटली कहिबो जे असम्पशन टा रॉन्ग, हाइपोथेटिकल प्रोपोजिशन टा रॉन्ग, तेणु डिलेमा होछि रॉन्ग. दिस इज हाउ ही कैन रेफ्यूट द डिलेमा. तेणु यहीटा हूँ रेफ्यूटेशन. तीन प्रकार रेफ्यूटेशन अच्छी. गोटे रेफ्यूटेशन रे सॉरी रेफ्यूटेशन दुई प्रकार अच्छी. गोटे रेफ्यूटेशन रे तुम्हें कौन करिवो, गोटे डिलेमा रे दुईटा एंटीसीडेंट दुईटा कन्सिक्वेंट अच्छी. से देखैबो जे कहिबो गोटे कन्सिक्वेंट फॉलो करू नाही ता एंटीसीडेंट रु ताहेले रॉन्ग एमती रिजेक्ट हो नहेले दुईटा जाका कन्सिक्वेंट तार एंटीसीडेंट्स रु फॉलो करू नाही. दिस इज कॉल्ड टेकिंग द डिलेमा बाय द हॉर्न्स. जदि गोटे कन्सिक्वेंट फॉलो करिबो नाही एंटीसीडेंट रु सेटा हबो टेकिंग द डिलेमा बाय वन ऑफ इट्स हॉर्न्स. एटा होची रेफ्यूटेशन जदि दीटा जाक कन्सिक्वेंट फॉलो कला नाही तार एंटीसीडेंट रु ताकू कुहा जिवो टेकिंग द डिलेमा बाय बोथ द हंस टेकिंग द डिलेमा बाय बोथ द हंस तेणु एटा हैला टेकिंग रेफ्यूटेशन 1 देन रेफ्यूटेशन 2 हैला एस्केपिंग बिटवीन द हंस ता माने दुईटा अल्टरनेटिव्स दिबो किंतु प्रकृत रे दीटा नथिबो आ गोटे थर्ड अल्टरनेटिव से बाहर करिवो जोटा ता पई ठीक थिबो तापरे रहिला तुमर रिबटल रिबटल मु तुमको कहिछि रिबटल ता रेफ्यूटेशन नुहे आमे गोटे काउंटर डिलेमा आनिबा काउंटर डिलेमा कोन करिबा एंटीसीडेंट दीटा को समान करिबा कन्सिक्वेंट दुईटा रे नॉट बसेबा नहेले तार कंट्रारीज नबा देन तांका प्लेस चेंज कर दबा सो वी विल गेट वन फेवरेबल कंक्लूजन तेणु तीनटा वे रे गोटे डिलेमा इनइफेक्टिव हुए गोटे होची टेकिंग द डिलेमा बाय द हंस आउ गोटे हैला एस्केपिंग बिटवीन द हंस आउ गोटे हैला तुमरो रिबटल नाउ वी विल डिस्कस सम क्वेश्चंस for your examination. By affirming the antecedent of a hypothetical proposition, we can dash its consequent in the conclusion. We can affirm its consequent. Eta hoche constructive dilemma. By denying the consequent of a hypothetical proposition, we can dash its antecedent in the conclusion. We can deny. जदि कन्सिक्वेंट को डिनाय करिबा एंटीसीडेंट को मध्य डिनाय करिबा द टू फॉर्म्स ऑफ मिक्स्ड हाइपोथेटिकल सिलोजिज्म आर कंस्ट्रक्टिव एंड डिस्ट्रक्टिव देन by denying the disjunct of a disjunctive proposition we can dash the remaining disjunct कौन करिबा जदि गोटे disjunct को डिनाय करिबा आर disjunct को आमे affirm करिबा then the conclusion of a mixed alternative syllogism is dash mixed alternative syllogism तार conclusion कौन conclusion होचे categorical the conclusion of a dilemma is either dash or dash dilemma रा conclusion कौन categorical or disjunctive then rebuttal as a mode of refutation of dilemma is possible only in the case of dash dilemma को dilemma रे rebuttal होची तुमरो complex constructive dilemma रे rebuttal होचे the dash of a dilemma are like the two horns of a dangerous animal एटा होचे the two alternatives of a dilemma a dilemma is materially refuted if it is shown that a premise or both the premises are wrong there are dash types of mixed syllogism 4 types in a simple destructive dilemma the conclusion is categorical the major premise of a dilemma is a combination of two dash propositions hypothetical propositions if in a syllogism one premise is disjunctive the other premise is categorical the syllogism is called as mixed disjunctive syllogism or disjunctive categorical syllogism if the minor premise denies the consequence of the major premise then the dilemma is called destructive dilemma then dilemma is a dash syllogism mixed syllogism the conclusion of a mixed or disjunctive syllogism is categorical then we will discuss one word answer how many kinds of dilemma do we have 4 kinds of dilemma how many hypothetical propositions are there in the compound hypothetical proposition of a dilemma 2 hypothetical propositions achi amaro what is the method of refutation of a dilemma by constructing its counter dilemma called it is called rebuttal the conclusion of a complex dilemma is what it is disjunctive proposition then whether the consequence of the hypothetical propositions in a simple constructive dilemma are same or different it is simple dilemma so consequence of the hypothetical propositions in a simple constructive dilemma are same or different it is same because by affirming the antecedent we affirm the consequent rahibo tumor conclusion re so this is same how many disjunctive propositions are there in a simple dilemma re keteta disjunctive proposition thae gotiye thibo minor premise how many disjunctive propositions are there in a complex dilemma complex dilemma रे केतरा थिबो minor premise रे गोटे आ गोटे होची तुमरो कंक्लूजन दीटा थिबो हाउ मेनी काइंड्स ऑफ द मिक्स्ड सिलोजिज्म्स आर देयर मिक्स्ड सिलोजिज्म्स आर 4 टाइप्स how many disjunctive propositions are there in a simple dilemma eta already kahi sarichi 1 in a constructive hypothetical categorical syllogism what is affirmed in the minor premise the antecedents are affirmed in the minor premise what type of proposition is the minor premise of a dilemma the minor premise is a disjunctive dilemma disjunctive proposition then short question what is hypothetical categorical syllogism give an example एठी तुमे लिखिबो the in a hypothetical categorical syllogism the major premise is hypothetical minor premise is categorical and conclusion also is a categorical conclusion and you will give one example if the sun is there then there will be light if the sun is there then there will be light there is sun therefore there is light what is alternative categorical syllogism give an example so here you write major premise is alternative proposition minor premise is categorical proposition and conclusion also is a categorical proposition you give an example Simma cannot be a student both in Ravenshaw College and in Salabala College. She is a student of Ravenshaw College, therefore she is not a student of Salabala College. Then state the rules of the hypothetical categorical syllogism. Hypothetical categorical syllogism, it has two rules. The first rule is by affirming the antecedent, we affirm the consequent. This is constructive, and by denying the consequent we deny the antecedent, this is destructive. Then what is the fallacy of affirming the consequent? When we violate eta already तुमको मु कहि सारिछि वर्तमान when we violate the rule of the rule 1 then we get the fallacy of affirming the consequent. What do you mean by the fallacy of denying the antecedent? When we violate the rule 2, we commit the fallacy of denying the antecedent. You will give one example here. Give an example of constructive form of mixed hypothetical syllogism. Constructive form ro mixed hypothetical syllogism ro तुम गोटे example दबो. Give an example of destructive form of mixed hypothetical syllogism. The example तुमको देइछे सेही example तुमे लिखिबो. State the rule governing mixed alternative syllogism. एठी rule टा लिखिबो mixed alternative syllogism रो rule लिखिबो. सेतिकी लिखिबो short question one word answer or one line answer. Give an example of mixed disjunctive syllogism. So mixed disjunctive syllogism रो गोटे example सेठी लिखिबो. Then what is disjunctive categorical syllogism? तमे सेठी लिखिबो what is disjunctive categorical syllogism. Then the next question is what is a dilemma? Dilemma लिखिबो एबे तुमको कहितले dilemma major premise is a compound hypothetical proposition, minor premise is a disjunctive proposition, and conclusion may be categorical, may be disjunctive. Then state the rules governing dilemma. Hypothetical categorical syllogism रो जो दुईटा रूल अच्छी से दुईटा रूल अच्छी डिलेमा रो किंतु टिके अलगा रूल तेणु से दुईटा जाक लिखिबो रूल्स by affirming the antecedents disjunctively in the minor premise we affirm the consequence in the conclusion. One second होची by denying the consequence disjunctively in the minor premise we deny the antecedent or antecedents in the conclusion. Then what do you mean by pure syllogism? Pure syllogism माने when all the propositions are same from the standpoint of relation, like pure categorical syllogism, pure hypothetical syllogism. Then what do you mean by mixed syllogism? Mixed syllogism means all the propositions are different from the standpoint of relation. तापरे short notes अच्छी तमर आसी परे rules of dilemma. What are the rules of dilemma लिखिबो. What is counter dilemma? तमने rebuttal टा लिखिबो. What is is escaping between the horns of a dilemma. This is refutation 2, this you write. Then taking the dilemma by one of its horns, you explain this and you give one example. Then disjunctive categorical syllogism, this also you write. Then invalid forms of pollendotollens and tollendoponens, you also write this. Okay. Thank you, students.